If you or a loved one is living with cancer, you probably have two focal points: how to rid yourself of it and how to prevent it from coming back. You'll get some terrific information today on Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger. We'll explore natural medicines which may enhance conventional therapies, share cutting-edge research, and offer insight on how diet and natural medicines can play an important role in treating and preventing cancer. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. Now, here is Dr. James Belanger.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cancer Concepts and Complements. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger from the Lexington Natural Health Center. Today, I'm going to talk about prostate cancer, advanced prostate cancer, and hormone resistance. I want to give you a better understanding of how prostate cancer becomes resistant to the current treatments that they have for it. They call the treatments hormonal therapies. So I want to go over all the mechanisms of how the cancer gets around the hormonal therapies and natural medicines which may help stop that to help prolong the life of patients with metastatic prostate cancer. Because unfortunately, right now, metastatic prostate cancer is incurable. When it spreads to the bones or often gets into the lymphatic system, the current treatments, unfortunately, just slow it down and prolong life. And they know a lot about how prostate cancer becomes resistant to the current therapies, and there's a whole host of studies being done on natural medicines which might help prevent some of those resistant mechanisms to possibly lengthen the life of patients with metastatic prostate cancer. Definitely more research needs to be done, but I'm going to outline what has been done so far. The current treatment right now, if the prostate cancer has spread to, say, the bones or the lymphatic system, where the surgery and radiation therapy wasn't enough to kill all the cancer, the current treatment is to lower testosterone and reduce the binding of testosterone, or what they call androgens, like male-like hormones, to these receptors in the prostate cancer cells. So the main treatment that they have right now is that they give injections of this drug called Lupron. And Lupron is a drug that affects the pituitary in the brain. The pituitary is the master gland. It controls a lot of hormones in the body, including testosterone production. And Lupron shuts down that part of the pituitary and helps reduce testosterone levels. And that can help for a couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years. They also, in addition to Lupron, they give this drug called Casodex. And Casodex is it's kind of like a tamoxifen for prostate cancer. It blocks androgen receptors, not estrogen receptors, but androgen receptors. And androgens include things like testosterone, and you might have heard of something called like DHEA. These are hormones that can influence the growth of prostate cancer, and they bind to these receptors on the prostate cancer cells. And when they bind, that stimulates growth. It causes DNA to replicate in prostate cancer cells and stimulates growth. Well, the Casodex drug binds to these androgen receptors and kind of interferes with testosterone and testosterone metabolites from binding to androgen receptors. And thereby it's like a decoy, and that helps too. And these two together, the Lupron with the Casodex, helps keep the prostate cancer at bay, usually for about 2 to 3 years. They also have treatments where they remove the testicles as an alternative to Lupron. It's called an orchiectomy. So that's another current treatment. But yes, unfortunately, only lasts about 2 to 3 years. And then, once it often becomes resistant to these Luprons and the Casodex, then patients usually pass away in another couple of years after that. They've had some new breakthroughs just in the last 5 years or so, I would say, of 2 new drugs that have come on the market, which can lengthen the survival and improve therapies when Lupron and Casodex stop working. And one's called Xtandi, and the other is called Zytiga. And Xtandi works kind of like the Casodex, is it binds to those androgen receptors, but it binds better than Casodex. It has a 5-fold greater binding capacity. But it interferes with the binding of the testosterone to the androgen receptor and then prevents that whole complex from stimulating the growth of prostate cancer cells. And they've done research showing that it improves overall survival by 18 months which is quite a long time. So it's been a big breakthrough. It doesn't help everybody. It's roughly about the response rate is around 50% or so. So, but it's a good breakthrough. It's pretty well tolerated. Some people get tired, and some seizures is a small percentage of people, but it's a good breakthrough. But unfortunately, cancer becomes resistant to that too. So I want to talk about how we can do things in addition to Xtandi to help make the prostate cancer not become as resistant. The other big breakthrough is this new drug called Zytiga. And Zytiga inhibits the production of testosterone from adrenal gland hormones. So, testosterone is produced in the testicles, but Lupron shuts that down, and if the man has the testicles removed, that removes the testosterone that way. But cancer can induce the production of testosterone from another source, from the adrenal glands. So we have these glands on top of our kidneys called adrenal glands, and they make androgen hormones like DHEA, and the prostate cancer cells can take that and convert it into testosterone to help produce it that way if it's not getting it from the testicles. And so this Zytiga inhibits the production of the androgens or testosterone from the adrenal gland precursors. And it works even when the Xtandi stops working. When Xtandi stops working, Zytiga can add an additional 15 weeks of response. Not a huge length, but it can work because it works in a different mechanism than Xtandi, and help also prolong overall survival. But again, it becomes resistant too. That's because it only works an average of 15 weeks. And so we need to talk about natural things that might help improve on these results. And the trouble with the Zytiga is they have to give you prednisone when you're on it, or you get issues with high blood pressure. And prednisone weakens the immune system, and we need the immune system to fight the cancer. So it's not the best thing right now. I like Xtandi better. If Xtandi doesn't work, Zytiga is the next choice, but it only adds an additional 15 weeks, and it has some immune suppressive effects, the prednisone that's added to that. Okay, so how does prostate cancer become resistant to these drugs, to Lupron, Casodex, Xtandi, and Zytiga? Well, I'm going to give you an analogy. And I gave this analogy when I was talking about breast cancer and the hormonal therapies for breast cancer. And so this analogy fits pretty good, too, for prostate cancer. So I was talking about, if you didn't catch that talk, I was mentioning how think about a company, a factory that's making chicken broth. So they have their celery and their carrots and all their spices all in their factory, but they don't have the chickens. So they contract with some company, and that company, drives over the chickens to them every day and drops off these chickens. And now they have the chicken, and they have all the other stuff, the celery, the carrots, and they're making this chicken broth. And so the chicken enters a conveyor belt, should we say, and the other compounds, the onions and the celery and everything are on other conveyor belts, and they all meet together in this one big pot. And then it's dumped together and cooked up, and the end product is chicken broth. Okay, so think of the chickens as the testosterone or those androgens coming in. And that's a major thing that prostate cancer cells need to grow. And then there are other things that are added to make this chicken broth. So prostate cancer cells use other things to help stimulate their growth besides testosterone. And you'll learn about some of them, like something called EGF and HGF and FGF and insulin, and I'll get to those in a second. So it's not just feeding off of testosterone. That seems to be the major treatment right now, is lower testosterone, interfere with testosterone's binding to androgen receptors. But prostate cancer cells use a lot of other things, and that's part of the reason why they become resistant to the hormone treatments. So you have to take away everything that prostate cancer likes. Just like if you took away the chicken and all the things that the chicken broth company needs to make chicken broth, well, then they can't make their chicken broth. And that's more successful. If you just take away the chicken, well, they can kind of synthesize something that tastes like chicken to make it taste still like chicken. But if you take a whole bunch of things away, then the end product will not be produced. And that's what we need to talk about. But the big pot that I was giving you an analogy to, the big pot where all this stuff empties into, is analogous to the androgen receptor. So testosterone comes into the prostate cancer cell, binds to this androgen receptor, and that complex binds to the DNA, stimulates the growth of the prostate cancer. Well, the other things that come in also eventually lead to the androgen receptor binding to the DNA too. So this IGF that comes into the cancer cell, this HGF, this EGF, all lead to signaling systems that eventually stimulate that androgen receptor to bind to the DNA. So it's like all these rivers coming together and pooling at the end, or all these conveyor belts with ingredients coming into the cancer, or into this big huge pot. And then the end result is a product: more cancer cells, more chicken broth, that kind of stuff. So what is, prostate cancer cells? What is the current treatment right now to affect the prostate cancer? Well, it's to decrease the production of testosterone. That's a major thing that prostate cancer cells use to help grow. And so the Lupron, the removal of the testicles, are things that lower the testosterone production. And then this new drug, Zytiga, also reduces the production of testosterone. So, if that's like analogous to all of a sudden the chicken broth company not getting as many chickens. So if they're not getting as many chickens, what will they start to do? Well, one thing that they can start to do is to start having chickens in their facility. If they can't get a constant supply of it because it keeps dwindling, then they make their own. And that's exactly what prostate cancer cells do. They have found that even though in the blood, the testosterone levels may be reduced greatly because the testicles have been removed or the Lupron has shut down the pituitary, that prostate cancer cells can start to make their own testosterone, or basically the cells that surround the prostate cancer, the stromal cells, start to make it. This was the same thing that happens with breast cancer. The stromal cells around the breast cancer cells start to make the estrogen for it if it can't get it from the blood. And that's what prostate cancer cells do. So they have found that the amount of androgens, or like testosterone and DHEA and things like that, at the site of a prostate cancer tumor is pretty much comparable to the amount that's in the blood in a man that's not even on some hormone-lowering therapy. That's how much it can start to make on its own. But this is where the Zytiga comes into play, because Zytiga does take away the precursors that it uses to try to make this testosterone, these androgens, the DHEA, and there's something called androstenedione, and even progesterone gets converted into testosterone. And that's what the prostate cancer cells are doing, is taking other things that they can use to make the testosterone if they can't get it directly from the testicles. So the Zytiga has been a breakthrough with that, and there's natural things that also can still help with this. But it's highly upregulated. Cancer cells can really upregulate all the things that they need to make their testosterone that they need. And Zytiga might not be strong enough to lower all of that production. So that's a major thing. Okay, then if we give back to that analogy of the chicken broth company. So, okay, we just reduced all the chickens that are being supplied to the company, and they've learned to try to deal with that. And so what else will they might do? Well, they might change their design to help extract more chicken flavor from the few chickens that they have. So they might add an analogy, a pressure cooker to the pot. So you take a little bit of chicken and you put it in a pressure cooker. It's really good for extracting out the chicken flavor from those bones and what little bit of chicken that you might have. You can tell I'm a cook, yeah. And so pressure cookers are a great way to make a great broth. Well, that's what cancer cells will do, is that they will alter their androgen receptors, right, to make it more efficient at using smaller amounts of testosterone, so that they're not getting a lot, but that little bit that they get, the androgen receptor now is much better at responding to that smaller amount. So just like that, the pot now has been modified to extract more flavor out of the fewer ingredients that are being supplied. Another thing, too, that the cancer cells will do is they'll mutate their androgen receptors. And this is important in leading to resistance to Casodex and leading to resistance to Xtandi. These two drugs, Casodex and Xtandi, they don't lower testosterone. They affect the binding of testosterone to androgen receptors. They basically get in the way, just like tamoxifen gets in the way of estrogen and estrogen receptors. The Xtandi and the Casodex affect the binding of the testosterone to the androgen receptor. And so now you get this decoy basically coming in to the DNA, and it doesn't work like it's supposed to, and there's no amplification of the prostate cancer cells. So it's kind of like changing the design of the pot or something like that. So they change it so that it will won't be stimulated anymore by the prostate cancer. So a lot of different things that happen, and it's a survival of fittest mechanism. If the cancer isn't getting the testosterone it needs, and if the androgen receptors are changed in some way, then the cancer will keep changing itself to stay ahead. The other thing is the amplification. If you go back to the analogy, there's not enough chickens coming in, not enough chicken broth, then a company will add things to amplify the chicken flavor. I talked about this last time. Like, for example, MSG can be added. Yeast extracts, other artificial and natural flavors can be added to enhance that little bit of chicken that might be there. And so prostate cancer cells increase their binding and their production of other growth factors, other things besides testosterone to help amplify it. And one of those is called IGF, which is insulin growth factor. So you'll see increased production of insulin growth factor in prostate cancer cells that are becoming resistant to hormonal therapies. So they upregulate that binds to a receptor and eventually binds to that androgen receptor that stimulates the growth independent of testosterone. So now it's like, okay, you're not giving me my testosterone I need. I'm going to start using a whole bunch of other things that I need to help grow. You don't give me the chickens for my chicken broth. I'm going to add a bunch of things in there to make it taste like chicken broth and still keep my product coming out. Other things that prostate cancer cells will use besides insulin, a whole bunch of things. One's called EGF. GF stands for growth factor. So there's insulin growth factor, IGF. There's EGF, which is called epidermal growth factor. There's HGF, hepatocyte growth factor. There's FGF, fibroblastic growth factor. But they're basically other things. You can think of them as other foods or other fuels for the cancer besides testosterone. But these things still lead to a binding of the androgen receptor to the DNA and growth of the prostate cancer. And so we need to talk about natural things that are going to take away all these foods from the cancer, all these things besides the testosterone. And that's what might lead to a much more prolonged survival in men with prostate cancer. And unfortunately, they don't have too many drugs that are approved right now for this. There's one new drug, I'm going to try to pronounce it right, cabozantinib, which is a new drug that affects this HGF thing that from binding to the prostate cancer. So they have a drug for that. So that's been a good breakthrough. But it's just blocking one thing. It's like taking one food away from the cancer, or two things if you count the testosterone. But it uses a whole bunch of other things. And it's a much more successful to starve it of all kinds of other things. And there's natural things from, they're going to learn from green tea to cruciferous vegetables to lycopene found in tomatoes, and all things together, then they might get some better results. When these growth factors bind to their receptors, it's like another conveyor belt coming in. So it's like the chicken broth factory expanding their production now to allow other ingredients to enter that big pot. So they set up a whole bunch of other conveyor belts, and they all dump into the same thing, the big pot, which is the androgen receptor, and leads to growth. And so there's the conveyor belts, my analogy for these signaling pathways. It's like when insulin or EGF binds to the receptor, it stimulates like a domino effect. And then these pathways that get stimulated. there's this a pathway, they call it the PI3K AKT pathway, and then the RAS MEK pathway. But they're basically, like a conveyor belt. As soon as the ingredient comes into the factory, then those ingredients go down a conveyor belt and then eventually end up in a pot. And that pot is the androgen receptor. So the growth factors bind to the receptors, stimulate these two pathways, PI3K and RAS MEK pathways, and that leads to growth. So a lot of the natural things we're going to talk about after the break are things that affect these signaling pathways. And then the last pathway is the interleukin-6 pathway. There's another compound, you can think of it as another food or another ingredient going into that chicken broth that stimulates the growth of prostate cancer, and it's called interleukin-6. And it binds to its receptor, interleukin-6 receptor, leads to a bunch of signals or a bunch of dominoes that lead to eventually stimulation of the prostate cancer. Okay, so we're going to take a break now. When we get back, we're going to start talking about natural medicines that help affect the testosterone, the androgen receptor production, and the amplification systems. This is Cancer Concepts and Complements. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger.
This is Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. If you would like to find out more about the Lexington Natural Health Center, please visit lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. That's lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. Now, back to this week's program.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cancer Concepts and Complements. Before the break, I was talking about a lot of different resistant mechanisms of how prostate cancer cells become resistant to the current hormonal therapies that they have. I talked about prostate cancer cells can start to make their own testosterone, their own hormones to feed themselves. And then they can help work with a smaller amount of testosterone. They can amplify their receptors and make them more efficient at binding smaller and smaller amounts of testosterone to help lead to growth as well. And then thirdly, they can increase their production of and their signaling systems for other growth factors besides testosterone that help influence their growth. So you think of testosterone as a food that's feeding the cancer, but the cancer likes to eat a lot of different things. It likes insulin growth factor and EGF and FGF and all these other growth factors. And if the cancer's not getting one of its favorite foods, the testosterone, then it's going to start to eat other things, if you understand the analogy there, and amplify those things. And so let's talk about natural things that affect all these resistant pathways. So the first is that cancer cells will start to make their own hormones. If they're not getting it from the testicles, because they've been shut down by the Lupron or removed through surgery, then the cancer cells will start to make testosterone from the adrenal androgens being produced by the adrenal glands like DHEA. And we'll start making it from things like progesterone. So they have three different ways of making testosterone. They call it, there's three different pathways. But basically, so they'll upregulate all these three pathways, anything that they can do to make their testosterone. And there's this particular enzyme, it's called AKR1C3, that gets upregulated in hormone-resistant prostate cancer by 5-fold. And then when that thing gets upregulated, it even increases estrogen production. And estrogen amplifies that insulin growth factor thing that I was talking about. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there's natural things that can affect that enzyme AKR1C3, the thing that leads to the increased production. But this is what, Zytiga has certainly caused has been good because Zytiga does reduce the adrenal androgens. But unfortunately, when it only works for an average of 15 months when Xtandi stops working. So obviously the cancer cells are doing other things to help become resistant, like increasing those amplification pathways. And they can still use a smaller amount of the testosterone by amplifying their androgen receptors. So we need to talk about that. And there isn't any current drugs that affect a lot of those other pathways. So what causes an upregulation of that enzyme, that AKR1C3 thing, that causes an increased production of testosterone? Well, something you've probably heard if you've listened to these other shows, TGF-beta. Transforming growth factor beta is something that is produced by those cells that are surrounding the prostate cancer. And they call them cancer-associated fibroblasts. They're cells that surround the prostate cancer. Make this thing called TGF-beta, and that thing stimulates the conversion of the DHEA from the adrenal glands into testosterone right at the site of the prostate cancer. And TGF even activates other pathways that amplify the whole testosterone signaling, like that PI3K pathway I was talking about. So it's important to measure TGF in every man with hormone resistant or any man with prostate cancer, and making sure it's not elevated. And if it is, lowering it down, because it's going to lead to resistance, either now or later. So it's something that needs to be dealt with. And there isn't a drug that lowers TGF right now, but there are natural things. Because there's research showing, there's a study in Nature Medicine, 1995, that measured TGF in the blood, showing that it was associated with more invasive forms of prostate cancer. So it's a simple test. You can measure it in the blood. There's a lab called LabCorp that has that. Comes back elevated, there are natural things. But before we get into that, another thing that you can measure to see if that enzyme AKR1C3 is starting to upregulate is VEGF. When that enzyme upregulates, it increases the production of another thing called VEGF, vascular growth factor. And that helps promote blood vessel growth in the cancer. And so if you measure VEGF, and it's elevated, it also indicates that this enzyme thing is being upregulated and something you want to deal with. So it's nice to have these blood markers so you can tell if what you're doing is making any effects before a PSA starts to rise, before the prostate antigen marker thing starts to rise. Because there's research showing that measuring VEGF is an important thing, that it's patients with metastatic disease are more likely to have that elevated, and it encourages the growth of blood vessels. There's a study done in Urology 1999. So measuring that's a simple test that can be done at labs like LabCorp as well, and there are natural things that lower that. So one of the things that has been studied are bioflavonoids. Bioflavonoids are a type of compound found in fruits and vegetables all throughout nature, and there's a whole wide variety of compounds called bioflavonoids. And they have been shown to target that AKR1C3 enzyme, even in just small amounts, dietary amounts, and reduce that. But you have to eat these things that have the bioflavonoids, which I'm going to get into. So the study was done in Carcinogenesis 2011, showing bioflavonoids from a wide variety of plants and vegetables and stuff can reduce that enzyme that upregulates the production of testosterone in prostate cancer cells. Red clover is the first one I want to mention. Red clover has bioflavonoids in it, something called coumestrol and biocanin. And, it grows in a lot of people's backyards, something you can eat, but it's something that they do have extracts and in pill form too. But red clover has been shown the bioflavonoids in it to inhibit that TGF. And by inhibiting the TGF, it reduces the activation of that enzyme that leads to production of testosterone. And so there's been a study done in Cancer Epidemiology Biomarkers Prevention 2002, took 38 men with prostate cancer. Before surgery, they gave them a red clover extract. And then when they did surgery, they noticed an increased cell death in the prostate cancer specimens versus those that didn't get the red clover. So it induces cell death, possibly by inhibiting TGF and affecting the whole conversion of testosterone. So it's something that needs more research, more looking into. It's a very well tolerated product. Another bioflavonoid that might affect it is quercetin, Quercetin. Quercetin, or some people say quercetin, but it is a bioflavonoid. It's found naturally in onions. Onions are the richest source, especially yellow onions. And, you cook them down, you're going to get lots of quercetin in there. It's also found in apples, too. But it's found in plants, too. and it has been studied when they give it to animals with prostate cancer to significantly reduce the volume and the weight of prostate cancer. And how does it work? It targets this enzyme that increases the production of hormones. But then on an extra note is it also affects those signaling pathways, those amplifiers that amplify the whole androgen pathway, like AKT, the PI3K-AKT pathway. And the quercetin in the animals has been shown to reduce blood vessel growth. So another very promising compound to study, or eating more onions too. The other thing is propolis. Bee propolis has been studied for this too. So 3 natural compounds that can reduce the production of testosterone from the adrenal precursors in prostate cancer cells, and may even affect other pathways. Another thing that affects TGF, but it's not a bioflavonoid, is neem extract. Now, I mentioned this many times before. Neem leaf extract. It has a wide variety of effects against cancer, but one of its effects is it affects this AKR1C2 enzyme and C3 enzyme, and helps reduce the production of those androgens from the testosterone. It also lowers TGF, which is the thing that helps increase the production of the androgens in the first place. Well, there was a study done in the AAPS journal in 2011 at the Mayo Clinic, from the Mayo Clinic. Oral administration of neem reduces prostate cancer growth in mice. And that's the mechanism affecting TGF as one thing. And also, neem has a wonderful ability to affect the immune system. Natural killer cells are cells in our body that can fight and destroy cancer cells. I've mentioned in a previous show that neem can activate natural killer cells, making them more efficient at killing cancer. And another thing that neem does, neem leaf extracts, is that they reduce suppressor cells, cells that protect the cancer from the immune system. So it has many effects, something that needs further research, looking very promising. There are other things that I've mentioned in previous shows that affect TGF, but they have not been studied for prostate cancer, so it's hard to say if they're good or not. One's called wobenzyme, I mentioned, and shiitake. I have found clinically, though, that wobenzyme, it's just a mixture of plant and pancreatic enzymes, to be very useful at reducing PSAs when it starts to elevate in men that are starting to become resistant to hormone therapies. And wobenzyme works by reducing TGF, which is the thing that helps produce more of the testosterone locally. So it's something that needs to be more studied as well. Pomegranate, a lot of men have probably heard that pomegranate is something that is very good for helping with prostate cancer. And one of its mechanisms is it might interfere with the production of testosterone from those adrenal androgens, from DHEA getting converted into testosterone. And it's been studied in the Journal of Steroid Biochemical Molecular Biology, 2014. They gave the animals pomegranate extract, and it reduced the steroids, the amount of those. They call them steroid hormones, testosterone, DHEA. They're called steroid hormones. And it reduced it after 20 weeks. And the compounds that are in the pomegranate is called elagitannins, ELLAGI, tannins. And so a good pomegranate extract, if you're taking a pill, needs to be standardized for these elagitannins, or ellagic acid it's also called. And they also have purified forms of that. That is the thing. I'm not a fan of pomegranate juice. I'd rather see men eat the pomegranate seeds to get these elagitannins, or take an extract. The pomegranate juice is going to have a lot of sugar, and sugar increases insulin, and I mentioned earlier that insulin is an amplifier. So that's not, the fruit juices are never the best way to treat. Eat the whole thing. That's the way it comes in nature. Or if you don't like to chew on pomegranate seeds, to take these pills that are more concentrated anyway. Pomegranate has been studied in men in the journal Prostatic Diseases 2013, John Hopkins. They took men that had rising PSA, but they didn't have any detectable metastases, and they gave them either 1 or 3 grams of pomegranate, and the PSA did not double as rapidly in the patients. So it didn't stop it, but it slowed it down. And its mechanism is possibly by reducing the production of these androgens. So you couple that maybe with Zytiga, the two might have a better effect together. That unfortunately hasn't been studied. Testosterone is made from cholesterol. And all these adrenal androgens, the DHEA, and there's something called androstenedione. And I mentioned, too, that progesterone is even converted into testosterone. Well, all these things are made from cholesterol. So, some researchers have wondered if statins or other drugs or other natural things that work like statins, if they can also help. And yes, they have been shown to help prostate cancer as well. By reducing cholesterol, it reduces the amount of testosterone being produced because you don't have the precursor to testosterone. And so, because this is a natural medicine lecture, instead of talking about a statin drug, there is a natural statin out there. It's called red yeast rice. There's a yeast called Meniscus, or you could call it red yeast, that grows on rice, or in Japan, they make a food out of it. They take the red yeast and they have it on the rice, and it's like ferments the rice, and then they eat that. And they found that this red yeast rice contains natural statins, something called lovastatin, and that they've made derivatives of lovastatin to come up with Lipitor and other statin drugs. But red yeast rice is a food eaten in Japan that naturally contains statins. And so they've studied, and statins lower cholesterol. Cholesterol is a precursor to testosterone. So they've studied that in the Cancer Prevention Research Journal, Philadelphia, in 2011, showing that when they gave animals red yeast rice extract, that it significantly reduces the growth of both androgen-dependent, that's testosterone-dependent prostate, and ones that have becoming resistant to hormonal therapies. So it works on both. And how did it work? It lowered cholesterol and found that the more it lowered the cholesterol, the more it reduces the tumor volume. And it also affects all those enzymes like that AKR1C3 enzyme that upregulates testosterone production. So red yeast rice would be something to look into further. I have rarely found it to have any side effects like statin drugs have. I rarely find red yeast rice to cause any kind of muscle aches in people or raise liver enzymes, which are things that you hear about the statin drugs doing. I always give coenzyme Q10 with red yeast. Cholesterol is made in the liver, and the same pathway that makes cholesterol makes this antioxidant in our body called coenzyme Q10. They're both made in the liver, and they're both made in the same pathway. And statins, including red yeast rice, the natural statins in there, might interfere with coenzyme Q10 production in the liver. And the reduction in the coenzyme Q10 might be responsible for some of the muscle aches and maybe even the liver enzyme elevation. So I always give coenzyme Q10 whenever I put somebody on a red yeast rice extract. And maybe that's the reason why I find it very well tolerated. So something to look into as well. Okay, so I'm going to take another break, and when I get back, I'm going to talk about another mechanism of resistance, changes to the androgen receptors. Cancer Concepts and Complements. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger.
This is Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. If you would like to find out more about the Lexington Natural Health Center, please visit lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. That's lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. Now, back to this week's program.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Cancer Concepts and Complements. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger. Before the break, I was talking about natural medicines which may reduce the production of testosterone at the site in the prostate cancer itself. So I was mentioning pomegranate and red yeast rice, for example, and red clover extracts, natural things that might help reduce the production of testosterone at the prostate cancer site. Well, even if the cancer can't make a lot of its own testosterone because it's being interfered with by any one of these natural substances or Zytiga, or the patient's still on, Lupron, then another thing that it will do is it will start to change the androgen receptors. The androgen receptors are the things that bind the testosterone, like the thing I mentioned, the pot. where all the chicken and everything dumps into the pot. If changing the design of the pot, I was giving you an analogy, so it's much more efficient at extracting out the flavors from all the ingredients in the chicken broth if there's not as much chicken going in there. And so that's what cancer cells do, is they will modify the androgen receptor to make it more efficient at using smaller amounts of testosterone. They'll even amplify the androgen receptors. So if there's more binding sites, if there's less testosterone, it will be able to grab up all of it instead of wasting any of it. You can think about it that way. Mutate it. It will mutate its androgen receptors as well, so drugs like the Xtandi and the Casodex won't be able to bind to them. So it will change it so that it won't be able to affect those drugs. And those drugs induce these things. So if the cancer is being interfered with by the drugs, the ones that survive are going to make some changes to themselves so they can stay ahead of the drugs. Well, there's natural medicines that might affect these changes that occur in the androgen receptor as well, stopping them from occurring and preventing the amplification of the androgen receptor. One of those is pomegranate. So I've already mentioned pomegranate has maybe several effects. It can reduce the production of testosterone at the prostate cancer site, but it's also been shown to decrease the genes that prostate cancer cells use to amplify the androgen receptor. And that's been studied in the Journal of Nutritional Biochemistry 2008. Another thing that's been studied to reduce the expression of androgen receptors so that they can't amplify themselves is a compound. It's a mixture of natural things. It's called Zyflamend. It's a mixture of ginger, rosemary, turmeric, holy basil, oregano, green tea, skullcap, and something called Chinese gold thread. So it's got a bunch of things in it. And it's been studied in the Nutrition and Cancer Journal 2012, where they gave oral doses to mice with castrate-resistant prostate cancer, that is, prostate cancer that no longer responds to hormonal therapies. And they found that it helped inhibit the growth of the cancer, and the mechanism of action is reduced the amplified androgen receptor. So the cancer wasn't able to utilize the smaller amounts of testosterone as easily because it didn't have the binding sites for it. It took away the pots from the chicken broth company. They didn't have as many pots. They can't make their chicken broth. So that's what Zyflamend can do. Raufia. Raufia is an herb. They call it Indian snake root. And supposedly Gandhi took it because it has a relaxing effect. I read that somewhere. It has anti-anxiety effects. It's used to treat high blood pressure too. But it has been studied, the root bark of it. And in the International Journal of Oncology, they took 4 groups of mice with prostate cancer. One was a control group. They gave them, just a placebo, and then 3 different doses of this herb Raufia. It's spelled Rauwolfia. And it was supplied by a company called Natural Source, which there's something in Raufia that has some toxicity called reserpine, and they remove that so that it doesn't have the reserpine, which if you read on the internet, it's associated with depression and stuff. So they remove that thing. So that wouldn't be an adverse effect in the Raufia at all. Well, so they gave this in different dosages, and they found that it reduces the tumor volume by 79% compared to the placebo group, and it inhibits the amplification of the androgen receptor by affecting pathways that lead to that. So it's another thing that might need more studies to see to reduce that from happening. Because when the Xtandi stops working, there's nothing else that affects that androgen receptor binding thing that's been approved right now. And anything that might help reduce that androgen receptor thing from amplifying itself might allow these other drugs to work longer. Another thing that's been studied, you might have heard of, is kava. Kava is an herb that a lot of men have, or people have in Fiji, where they drink kava, and it's part of a ceremony. and it has a lot of relaxing effects. It's been studied for anxiety. And they found that men that live in Fiji have a lower incidence of prostate cancer. So some researchers said, I wonder if there's, any scientific basis behind this. So they studied it in the PLOS1 journal in 2012. They gave mice prostate cancer, androgen resistant, so the hormone resistant prostate cancer, and they gave them kava, and they found that it reduced the tumor growth by 60%. And how did it work? It affected the androgen receptors, the downregulated androgen receptors. And what was really interesting is that it even affected androgen receptor mutations. So another thing that prostate cancer cells do is they change their androgen receptors. They make some modifications to it. Like I was saying, modifying the pot, turning it into a pressure cooker, something modifying it. When cancer cells modify the androgen receptors, the drugs like Xtandi and Casodex can't bind as well and affect them. Well, kava reduces these mutations, they call them splice variants, reduces the androgen receptor mutations and the regular androgen receptors as well. And then on top of it, it decreased the TGF, the thing that amplifies the testosterone in the first place, and some of the amplifying pathways, like this HGF, CMET pathway, and other pathways like that. So it works in many different ways. So kava is something. Kava, you probably will read that it can raise liver enzymes. I rarely see that. It's been reported, but it's something that has been reported, something that should be monitored, is checking liver enzymes. But it has a nice added benefit of reducing anxiety as well, helping sleep if somebody's stressed out from the whole cancer experience. Okay, the last thing that affects the androgen receptor is boswellia. Boswellia is frankincense, and it has been studied in the Cancer Research Journal 2009, where they tested an extract of boswellia called AKBA. It's a compound found in boswellia, found that it suppressed something that modifies the androgen receptor, called SRC. The androgen receptor, when the SRC binds to it, it's much more efficient at binding small amounts of testosterone. So it's like I mentioned the pressure cooker, much more efficient at extracting out all those nutrients and all those flavor compounds from the chicken broth. And it's been studied in vivo too, in animal studies in Plantamedica 2006. Another added benefit of boswellia, besides affecting the androgen receptor pathway, is it might block some of those other pathways, the FGF pathway, fibroblastic growth factor pathway. It's really common for prostate cancer cells to activate the clotting system in the body. So we have these proteins in our blood. One's called fibrinogen and one's called thrombin and stuff. Well, they will tend to elevate in men with prostate cancer when it's starting to become resistant to hormone therapies. So it's a very common occurrence to see an elevated level of fibrinogen in the blood. And that makes the blood, thicker than normal, makes a person more at risk for clots. But the cancer does that because fibrinogen then deposits around the prostate cancer and acts like a magnet to bind this growth factor called FGF. And so the fibrinogen binds, the FGF binds to the fibrinogen, and now the cancer gets its food that it needs. So it just attracted this thing that it likes besides testosterone to help it grow because it's not getting as much testosterone now. And boswellia is very good at lowering fibrinogen. I mentioned there's some other things too, enzymes found in fermented soybean called nattokinase, some enzyme called lumbrokinase, but the one that has been studied for prostate cancer is boswellia. So it's a very frequent thing that I'll do is measure fibrinogen in the blood. Any lab can do that, not just LabCorp, but any lab. You measure in the blood. If it's elevated, it's associated with a poor prognosis in men with prostate cancer because it helps activate growth pathways. It helps bind FGF, fibroblastic growth factor, which is needed for growth. Boswellia is something that can lower it, so I'll put men on boswellia, recheck fibrinogen, make sure it goes down. Okay, so now we're done with the androgen receptor part, and I have about 3 minutes. I'm going to talk briefly about some other amplification pathways. Then we'll finish up next week. Insulin is a amplifier. So I mentioned just FGF is an amplifier, and HGF, there's also IGF, insulin growth factor. So again, just think of it as another food for the prostate cancer besides testosterone. If it's not getting this testosterone, then it's going to use other things to help feed itself. FGF, the HGF, and now IGF. There isn't any drug right now that is approved that reduces IGF. So this is something that natural medicines need to look at. And I talked about this with breast cancer as well. Flaxseed, for example, has been shown to help reduce the growth of prostate cancer. Ground flax seeds. Ground flax seeds, when they enter the gut, the bacteria in our gut, if you have the healthy bacteria, the probiotic bacteria, help convert the lignins that are in the flaxseed fiber into something called enterolactone. And enterolactone is a compound that reduces IGF. And so that has been studied to reduce prostate cancer. Some people will read on the internet that flaxseed increases the growth of prostate cancer. No, that's not what there was a study that was done where they did biopsies of men with normal prostates and prostate cancer. And they found that men that had prostate cancer had a higher amount of what's called ALA in their prostate cancer cells. Well, not too many men eat flax seeds or have flaxseed oil. ALA is found in other fats besides flax. In particular, it's found in canola oil. Canola oil is in a lot of things. And yes, it does have the same fatty acid that flaxseed has, ALA. But canola oil also has a bunch of other things in it. And one thing is called erucic acid, ERUCIC, I think it's spelled. And that has been actually shown to be a carcinogen. And so it's possible that study finding was men just having a lot of canola oil, and that erucic acid and the ALA got in there, but the erucic acid increased prostate cancer. Because when they actually studied flaxseed itself in animal models, it actually inhibits the growth. And the flaxseed has these compounds in it, the enterolactones, once they're formed in the gut, that take away IGF. So I'm running out of time, so I'm finished this up next week, and I'm going to talk about green tea. I'm going to talk about cruciferous vegetables, substances found in celery called apigenin. I'm going to talk about omega-3 fatty acids. All these things have been studied to help reduce these amplification pathways in prostate cancer that may be useful to add to the hormone therapies to help make them work better and longer. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's show. So that's what I'm going to talk about next week. And if I finish that, I'm going to talk about blood vessel growth factors. This is Cancer Concepts and Compliments. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger.
Thank you for joining us this week. Cancer Concepts and Compliments with Dr. James Belanger can be heard live every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Pacific Time, 9 a.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We hope to see you next week for another show.